Welcome. My name is Nicole Berry, and I'm the Executive Director of the Armory Show. I'm pleased to introduce our esteemed panelists today, Benjamin Sutton, Allan Schwartzman, Lucy Mitchell-Innes, and Allegra LaViola. Today's conversation will examine the state of the art market in relation to an unpredictable global financial market, highlighting trends in contemporary art as they relate to shifting global conversations and politics. The talk will be led by Benjamin Sutton. Benjamin is sorry that I have my back to you, is a journalist and editor based in Brooklyn. He's the editor for the Americas at the Art newspaper, and he previously held positions at Artsy, Hyperallergic, and ArtNet, among others. Allan Schwartzman is the founder and principal of Schwartzman & He has more than 30 years' experience advising some of the world's most influential and sophisticated collectors, informing their holdings of contemporary art both individually and in conjunction with their stewardship of major museums. His art advisory firm also specializes in legacy planning and advisory work for artists and artists' estates, museums, and civic and cultural initiatives. Allan is a founding curator of the New Museum in New York and has written for numerous publications, including The New Yorker and The New York Times. Lucy Mitchell-Innes co-founded Mitchell-Innes & Nash in 1996 with her husband David Nash, with a gallery on Madison Avenue. In 2005, Mitchell-Innes & Nash opened a second space in New York's Chelsea neighborhood. Prior to opening the gallery, Lucy Mitchell-Innes worked at Sotheby's from 1981 to 1994, where she served as head of the Contemporary Art Department in Europe, then in New York as worldwide director of the Contemporary Art, Latin American Art, and Contemporary and Modern Print departments. Lucy served as president of the Art Dealers Association of America from 2009 until 2012. She is currently a member of the Selection Committee of Art Basel, and she previously served on the Selection Committee of Art Basel Miami Beach from its inception in 2001 until 2009. She also sat on the IRS panel for the evaluation of works of art from 2002 to 2009. In 2014, Art News recognized Ms. Mitchell-Innes as one of, quote, the 25 art world women at the top. Allegra LaViola was born and raised in New York City, where she continues to live. She received an MA in art history from the University of St. Andrews, Scotland, and subsequently lived in Venice, Italy, and London, England. After returning to New York City, she worked at several galleries and an art advisory before starting her first gallery in 2008 on the Lower East Side. She opened Sargent's Daughters in 2014, and in autumn of 2022, the gallery will open a second location in Los Angeles. Thank you again for joining us this evening. We can't wait to see you all at the fair in September. With that, I'll turn it over to Ben.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you to the Armory Show for having us here. Thank you, Soho House, and thank you all, our panelists, for being here and for making yourselves available. I wanted to start off by talking about the unprecedented times that are referenced in the title of tonight's panel. There are any number of unprecedented times that we could invoke. There are so many unusual forces shaping our everyday lives right now, from the Russian war in Ukraine and the energy crisis and the grain crisis, the long tail of the COVID pandemic, the crypto market crash, the general financial instability, and fears of recession. I could go on. I wanted to ask each of you, and we'll start with Lucy and work our way down the line. I wanted to ask each of you how one of these unprecedented forces has shaped your business and what you've done to adjust to your work and how it's sort of impacted how you move through the art world.
Is that what I did? Yes. Yeah. I'll take this off when I speak. I'm looking at the list which you said: finance, politics, epidemic, war in the Ukraine, energy, and inflation.
You could just keep going all night.
In my lifetime, I've been through finance, politics, wars, energy, and inflation. But the epidemic was actually uncharted waters. for all of us, and for a gallery which, you know, with works of art, and for a gallery or a museum, and all of us here, I think, know that we, our sustenance comes from looking at works of art. And for 2.5 years, we couldn't look at anything. So then the question becomes, if you actually have a business, how do you sell works of art that people can't come and see? And it involved changing directions really fast. And I'm talking about weeks that we had to do this, because we were all locked down. We all had to learn how to make use of the platforms that we had, and use them, and make it function for a business. It was, you know, a radically different experience, and it worked in the sense that people bought works of art during the epidemic, during the first 1.5 years of the epidemic, that they had never seen. And, there are works of art that you can, if you are experienced and seasoned, you can look at a work of art and you can see, what you can't see. But that is not always the case with a collector. And there were a lot of collectors in Asia who were actively buying during lockdown. And it was really amazing how quickly this kind of caught on. And then the next thing that happened is that, traditional American collectors, the backbone of the culture of the United States and the New York, they started looking at works of art online, which they couldn't see, and began to think, well, they would buy that too. They could buy that. They could buy things they had never seen. And then the next thing that happens is that quite early on, we actually opened up and started installing a couple of some exhibitions. And we had a number of works that sold to people in New York who were within a 3-block radius of the gallery. And we said, well, don't you want to come in and look at it? This was a little bit later into COVID, where you could put on a mask and come out. And they said, no, no. And I'm talking about people who really know what they're doing. It was a big adjustment, and it still is. Going into COVID was difficult. Coming out of COVID was even more difficult. And it still is adjustment, because do you need to look at works? Do you need to go to an art fair? Do you want to risk you're definitely going to get exposed to COVID if you go to an art fair, it's for sure. So then, that these are all questions which surround. But there is a social part which people were really missing, as well as the visual experience, which people were also really missing. And so I would say that it was through the epidemic that I learned an enormous amount about how people, their cultural lives are sustained or not. Something which, again, an experience we had never been through. And the other thing, and I don't want to take too much more time, but is that the epidemic, the impact of the epidemic on the artists was absolutely extraordinary. It ranged from artists who couldn't work in their studios, either were locked out of their studios, couldn't work, or just couldn't work mentally, emotionally couldn't work, to artists who locked themselves in their studios and never came out and just worked. And we started to see work that was very dark, that reflected the fears of personal fears and the fears, the global fears, we started to see the impact. We're seeing it now coming out. So, I mean, I'll stop now because I can always start up again. But those are just a couple of my thoughts. I mean, I could go through the rest of it, but we've all been through that before. So,
Yeah,
okay.
no, that was great. Allan, over to you.
Is this on? No. Is this on? Yes. Well, I'll answer this in like 2 or 3 ways briefly. Shockingly, there's been shockingly little impact on all of these issues on most of the collectors that I work with, if not all of them. Some of these are very seasoned collectors who, as Lucy has referred to, have been through many different cycles, and are people who have who are prepared for tough times. Having said that, there were a couple of collectors I work with who when they had the time to step back and look at their lives and what art means for them, and as they began to become acutely aware of the kind of battleground of museums that paralleled a political and wider cultural battle isn't even the right word, but reckoning. They wanted to really rethink what they were doing and reorient themselves in terms of moving forward. So it tended to increase the appetite for a few collectors we work with in very contemporary art and at a much greater volume than they would have in any previous decade, in part triggered by the fact that there were so many artists they were becoming aware of who were themselves emerging, or voices they were not familiar with but have been around but have not been were not being foregrounded. I think some of that, some of the fact that things haven't seemed to have a huge impact is, I think that what we may be facing as a society and a world has the potential, the likelihood even, to be quite cataclysmic in a short period of time, that I think people just aren't ready to deal with that. They're kind of, enjoying being out there and enriching themselves. I personally find these last few years to be an incredibly rich time for new art in a way that 5-10 years ago I would have said the opposite. So it's been an exciting time in terms of looking at new work. We'll get into more of that, I'm sure, in this talk. But personally, my previous advisory firm was acquired by Sotheby's in a sort of unprecedented deal, and I was the least likely person of the people I know who they thought would ever work at Sotheby's, and actually found myself really enjoying it once I kind of figured out where I belonged, which was not in auction, and the company changed hands, and I could see immediately that that this was not a place that that would be fertile for what it is that I was working on, and where I saw places that I could take that business. So I sought to leave in advance of the end of my contract, and I had certain conditions within my contract that permitted me to leave quite favorably early on because of the sale of the company. And yet they didn't want me to leave. And so the beginning of COVID for me was like I shouldn't even be saying this publicly, but I guess I am. was a time, it was a battle time for me. It was like reclaiming my identity as my primary identity as an advisor. And so I started up a new advisory firm. And so a lot changed for me. I was able to leave with staff and clients. So we created an advisory in a fundamentally different way, in many different ways than I had practiced it before, or that or different ways from how I functioned in relation to staff. And we started doing advisory work for artists and estates. And this is work that's not in any way meant to conflict with what galleries do, but to complement what they do. And I thought that that would be a part of the business that would take a while to establish comfort in. Whenever you do something new that kind of goes across a border, it can be threatening to a lot of people. And what we found was the opposite, that it grew very rapidly because there is so much need in terms of both estates and mature artists in planning for their estates, or even in other aspects of what they do that go beyond what either their galleries had traditionally done, or their increased needs that artists have had that they didn't have 25 years ago. And so, so for me, it was like, okay, the business, the work with the clients didn't really change much. The work as a work environment changed hugely. And I also noticed that many galleries were becoming increasingly focused on transactions. And it seemed like a lot of services to artists in a number of galleries were being streamlined. And so we kind of took the opposite approach and saw that what we do as an advisory service is that we have clients that we're serving. They're either collectors or artists, or in some cases museums. And so I chose to increase what we did rather than decrease it. Not that there was the revenue to, not that the revenue was increasing at the rate at which the costs were increasing, but to me it became increasingly important to be visible, trying to build a sustainable art ecosystem, which seemed to me to be increasingly threatened or pushed to the sides by an increasingly transactional art market.
That's great. Allegra?
Well, I suppose the impact on me and on the gallery was that, at first I was just absolutely terrified that everything was over. And so I went into kind of a tunnel vision of how I could retain any kind of interest of the collectors and people who couldn't come into the gallery anymore, because the idea of not being able to actually be in the gallery and put on physical exhibitions just left me completely at sea. So I started a small weekly email blast called Small Joys, where I offered one work by one artist each time, and it was under $5,000, so it was very easy and accessible in case this turned into a financial disaster. And what it did was actually propel a lot of people's interest, because then they were trapped at home and they could spend just a little bit of money and acquire something, and it was something that wasn't too difficult to spend money on, and it was works on paper or small, tiny little things, and then that actually really focused a lot of people in this way and brought a lot of attention to it. And then subsequently I learned how much money people were willing to part with online, having, as Lucy said, never seen the work before, never seen any piece by this artist before. And for me, it was significant sums of money. And that was really quite surprising to me, because I had never myself bought anything without seeing it in person first, even by artists who I have known and loved for a long time. So that was quite amazing. And then, it seemed like everything there kept being more and more and more, and the activity was really thrilling. But at the end of it, I became very sick of it all because, as Allan said, the transactional element of it just wasn't. I mean, look, I like to make money and I like to make the artist money, but it felt like I could have been selling anything. I could have been selling a table or glassware or potatoes, and that wasn't really interesting to me. So it definitely brought out the idea that the gallery and the curation and the ideas and the thoughts and the talking to the artists and the being with the artists and ideas behind everything was really the most interesting part. And I think a lot of people felt that because in September, after the pandemic, coming back to New York, I put on a show that was the first show of a young artist, a Mexican-American artist named Ruben Ulysses Rodriguez Montoya, and it was a very difficult, weird, sculptural, strange show, and I was
Fantastic.
fairly terrified that it was going to be, a financial disaster and nobody would care and whatever else. But then I actually got this New York Times review, and people bought the work, and going around to all of the other galleries, Company on the Lower East Side had a Kasia von Zeipel, and Mitchell Ennis Nash had Jacoby Satterwhite on in that September, and it really felt like people were, like, look, this is why we're here. We're here for the art and just the physical experience of that, and this other vein that had transpired where people were comfortable with the idea of spending money without seeing the work could exist in parallel, but have to be there for
Not
the
without
art.
the embodied experience.
Yes. And that was great. That was very reassuring. Amid all the sadness you mentioned.
Right, yes. Well, so I wanted to talk a little bit more about that notion that this kind of transactional approach and just the sort of more and more of people wanting to buy art during the pandemic. That phenomenon, I feel like I've heard referred to a lot, both by dealers and by people at auction houses. The sense that the market, in a sense, because everybody was stuck online, buying art online, and doing research online, there's been a sort of broadening or deepening of the art market. There are just more art collectors now, it seems, than there were 2.5 years ago. And where I want to get with this is the question of sort of the anticipated recession and this truism we often hear that the art market is sort of quote-unquote recession-proof. And we saw that even at the last recession in 2008, it took a number of years for the art market to dip significantly. And I'm curious what you think about that sort of, that truism, that the art market is somewhat recession-proof, and if that has become even more so the case now, now that we have just gone through 2 years of galleries and auction houses finding really creative ways to reach people in their homes and on social media and through all these new channels that we didn't have, 15 years ago. Allan, would you like to go first?
Well, the reason why the art market is often recession-proof is because the people who are driving the market are so rich that when the stock market goes down, they've got more money to put into art. And through the year, I hate to say years, it's decades, that I've been working with collectors. Every collector I've worked with, even though none of them have approached collecting from the perspective of investment, they've all said that they've done better with their art and the rise in value over time than they have with their businesses or with. This is particularly true of people who have hedge funds and invest other people's money, which is a vast percentage of people collecting post-war and contemporary art. I think we're in really unprecedented times right now, both in the world and in the art world. The number of individuals, plus and as well the amount of money that has entered into it in recent years is so vast. It's beyond the capacity for the art market to evolve in what had become orderly ways that it understood. I can't tell you how many times I've come in contact with the work of an artist that had not yet shown, who was being introduced by a gallery, and the works were $4,000 each. And sometimes I bought a work, sometimes clients have bought works. And then within 6 months, the waiting list is so vast. And it's not even in those instances that the prices rise that greatly, but just the number of people who one can consider, or which many galleries are considering, viable, serious collectors, it's just multiplied tremendously. So I think that comes with real challenges. It's challenges of distribution, of decision making, of long-term confidence, and so on. I think that we are facing a nexus of conditions in the world that could have a greater impact than they appear to be having thus far on the art market, or in relation to money in general. And it's like, I don't mean to be to speak apocalyptically, but I do think that having had time and spent a lot of time at home, and with one's family, or in conversation with the people who have been most enriching for people who had a lot of time, has it's broadened. It's broadened the enthusiasm, and it's sped up the whole process of prices rising. And then we see evening sales where an artist whose work was $80,000 sells for $3 million. And now all 3 auction houses have a 21st century evening sale. And the numbers there are staggering and continue to rise. For some of those artists, the demand, I don't know if the price level's maintained, but certainly demand continues, because you have great demand among institutions for certain kinds of work that then drive a lot of donations from people who are wanting to get access to such work that couldn't get it otherwise. But when I look at those 21st century sales, I have to say that, depending upon the house, but with all houses, it's the vast majority of them are artists that I don't have any real confidence in. It's a kind of manic appetite. And so how this time gets sorted out in terms of art, and where that fits within an equation of the stresses in the larger world, I think remain to be revealed. But having said that, I return to the point that there's more and more money by richer and richer people that values art. And there are many people who are very serious who have entered the art market in recent years who collect in fundamentally different ways from how collectors of previous generations collected, but not any less valid ways of collecting. So that wealth is, it's all very international, and it's true. A lot of the rich got a lot richer at a time where most of society was really challenged. Did I answer that question?
I think so. Yeah. And then some. Yeah. Lucy, I wanted to ask you sort of your feeling on this, and especially I think something Allan just brought up that I think is interesting is this this question of sort of artists' longevity, and this idea that the market is really elevating a lot of artists right now because there is this influx of money and this and also just a lot more artists than there have been in past generations. I wanted to ask you, your gallery works with a lot of artist estates, a lot of older artists, but also a lot of younger artists. Allegra mentioned Jacoby Satterwhite, Tiana McCloudon is working with the gallery now. I wanted to ask you, and then Allegra, I'd love to hear your take on this as well, but amidst that kind of speculative and very sort of cash-infused market, how do you take care of artists?
How do you take care of artists? I mean, just to give a little background to you, I absolutely concur that the market is far, far bigger than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15. I mean, it's, time spent in Asia, and you could spend it in Hong Kong, Shanghai, Taipei, or Seoul, all with different collector bases. And then ditto Europe. I was standing with a colleague in Basel at Art Unlimited. We were doing this Martha Rosler presentation at Art Unlimited. And she was, people were coming in who I didn't know and didn't recognize, and she was telling me who they all were, and they were all German billionaires, one after the next. Yes, it's true. But actually, it doesn't really, wealth doesn't really qualify you for owning automatically, being able to own and buy works of art. How do we protect our artists? We're pretty careful, very, very careful. We work on, it's the old-fashioned thing. It's building relationships with people based on mutual trust and respect. They trust our eye and our integrity. We trust their motives, and generally that's the basis. That's the foundation for a relationship with collectors, and making sure that the artists are placed in, solid collections and places which will benefit, them long term.
Sure. Well, I wanted to, one more question on that line before tossing it to Allegra. But I know also your gallery, Mitchell, Innes and Nash, had pretty early on started an online viewing room program during the pandemic, and like we were saying before, that opens up collecting artists and finding artists' work to a whole wider range of people. Does that make your job caring for an artist harder in a way, because there are all these people now out on the internet who could be acquiring your artist's work?
Yes, it's a, whether this is working or not. Yeah. Yes. It early on in the pandemic, the online viewing rooms were tremendously successful. We were finding ourselves selling to people in parts of the world which we had were unfamiliar with, and collectors who we were completely unfamiliar with. And as you know, we are subject to the law, OFAC laws. For anybody who doesn't know what OFAC is, it's a list which the U.S. government keeps of individuals who are it's illegal for us to do business with. So just to go back to online platforms, early on, they were very successful. They mutated to become completely unsuccessful as people began to emerge and go out. And now we're in this kind of hybrid situation where people will buy without being able to see things, but then they have to see things. So having thought that art fairs had become obsolete, that was wishful thinking on my part, because no, they haven't. And
Allegra, I wanted to ask you the same question about, how do you how do you sort of care for an artist who, because I think there are a number of artists I think of who you showed very early on, people like Jenna Gribben and Jordan Castile, who've since become this kind of global phenomena, and have certainly seen their work crop up at auction a lot. How do you, when you kind of see that happening to an artist you've shown, how do you approach kind of protecting them while also promoting them, and that sort of that dance?
Well, I think it's quite difficult, mainly because there are a lot of people who come out of nowhere, and because I am, showing artists who are very often at the beginning of their careers, and the gallery is fairly young, I'm not always in a position to just turn down people who have a legitimate interest in the artist, and you want people to be excited about the work. In the case of, some artists who have gone on to have very high auction results, I know who those works were sold to, and some of them are not random people. I mean, they are legitimate collectors who have decided to, sell at auction. And would putting something in writing prevent that? I've sold things for people, on the secondary market. Of course, you want to try and keep things out of auction, but at the same time, can you do an FBI search on every single person who emails you asking, interested in something? Certainly at the beginning, it's very difficult. You want to create relationships with collectors, and you want to make sure that your artists end up with people who will really love the work and keep it for a long time and live with it forever. But it's not always possible to secure that. Now, there are, new ideas surrounding this, which, personally I'm quite in favor of. Things like fair chain, which have been, emerging onto the markets as a way of being a kind of digital certificate of authenticity, and also a royalties program where the artists, when the work is sold, this follows the piece, and if it is sold again at auction or changes hands even privately, the artist gets a percentage, and as does the original gallery that sold it. To me, this seems like something that could actually eliminate a lot of the problem, because then there's not this associated shame with parting with a work if the artist then receives part of the profits, because part of the problem with selling a work at a vast, vast profit, things that I sold to people for $6,000 that sell for $600,000 later at auction, like 3 years later, it's in bad taste partly because the artist receives nothing. So if the artist receives something, perhaps that changes the dialogue.
May I add one thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
Which goes back a little bit to an earlier part of the conversation, which is part of the thing about the art market is that regardless of what's going on in the economy and in the wider world, the art market's constantly reevaluating what it thinks of how it values certain artists' work, and whether there are price rises where the market reaches a kind of consensus at a certain point that they believe so much in an artist that a price can rise significantly, and that they don't have great confidence in certain artists who reach a kind of plateau or reach a dip. And this happens regardless of what the other economic and societal factors are. And I just think that's important to bear in mind. It's not a monolithic market.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I'm going to piggyback off that to talk about one of the media and genres that has sort of, though it's not a monolithic market, there is maybe one vein of contemporary art that has really dominated for the past 5 years to decade, which is figurative painting. And it's really sort of become very dominant both at art fairs and especially at auctions, and it's often a lot of work that's dealing sort of implicitly or explicitly with art history. It's very colorful, often quite large scale. There's often reference to contemporary politics or issues of representation, and it really, especially at auctions, it just feels like it is really like the force to be reckoned with. But that's not always been the case. I mean, 10 years ago we were in a very coming out of a very abstract period. I guess I'm curious. Does that notion alone that figurative painting is kind of the dominant force? Does that resonate with you? Does that feel right? And also, is there some other medium or art form that we should be on the lookout for that you feel is coming for figurative painting? I'll start with you, Allegra, because you've shown a lot of fantastic figurative painters.
Well, I was. I remember being extremely surprised because I did show a lot of figurative painters when it was deeply unfashionable. And the first time that I realized that things were changing was when I showed Jordan Castile and they put her on the cover of Flash Art. And I remember being like, wait, Flash Art? Really? Flash Art is like sticks on the floor. They're not going to put a figurative painting on the cover of Flash Art. And I thought that was sort of that kind of clicked into motion that something had shifted. And then, yes, I mean, there is a great deal of figurative painting around. Some of it extremely wonderful and some of it less so. But now I've forgotten the question. Is there
something
heralding?
coming to unseat figurative painting?
I mean, there's always something coming to unseat something else, right? I mean, there's always something that will come that's a bit new or different because people want to push against what the dominant trend is, and the zombie figure, abstraction, and now we're in zombie figuration, and I'm sure there's something else that will come soon at the heels. But people do love. I think the reason why figurative painting always comes back eventually is because people connect with it, right? I mean, why are there frescoes in churches? People can understand it. They can know the stories without having to read them, So it's always going to be there.
Yeah. Lucy, I wanted to ask you a similar question, especially because you work with a number of artists whose work is very sculptural, very conceptual, very, I don't want to say unsellable, but challenging, I would imagine, to present to a collector. Thinking of artists like Pope L, or even Jacoby Satterwhite, who we mentioned before, Sarah Brahman, like artists who make either very large scale or very complicated or often very difficult work, one would imagine, to live with. How do you kind of approach that? Sort of, how do you kind of position that work successfully in a market that is so focused on maybe one particular genre?
Well, I think the question you're asking is, how do we build the program? And for me, it's essential that there is that there is a conceptual component to an artist's work. So I think that's, and this does not exclude painters and how they paint, the way they paint, what they're thinking about, where it's going, their links to certain influences or appropriation, and the sort of, I think that's a huge factor now in the last Well, I guess really since the pictures generation, but certainly now everybody has permission to appropriate anything they want in any way at any time, which is great. And so, unsaleable, yes, we're pretty long in unsaleable, but believe it or not, we actually do sell
Clearly, it's
a
working.
tremendous amount of Popel's work, and he's the real deal in every possible way. He owns the subject, which is the plight of the African American man, and he is. We started working with him in 2007. Because in 2008 I sold the work to the Museum of Modern Art, and the market crashed, and I remember them calling up to whine about paying for it and this and that. So I know, and it was really he was, people. He was just there making his work, doing his thing. And long before this whole move towards recognition of African American artists. For me, you could think of somebody like Tiona. I mean, I see it, a bell went off in my head, and you just have that split second when you just know that this is going to be sustaining, intellectually, emotionally, conceptually sustaining. And I had that when I worked at Sotheby's. There was sometimes before even the door had opened to go in to look at a work of art. And the moment I saw it, I knew. I just knew. And I have the same experience when I'm looking at artists to join the program. Now, the difficult part about this is that I'm not alone in this. And, one has to often take on artists who are young to be in a program like ours. They're young to have the demands made on them in terms of, and the demands are even bigger if they go to a mega gallery. That's about production and transaction, as we've talked about. But if you don't do it, they'll be somewhere else. So that you have to they have to come, and they have to. Sometimes it's important that an artist can sort of sit in the shade for a while and just grow, develop, evolve, try things, have it work, not work. And they're very welcome to come and have it not work at Mitchell and Nash, or work. But so I don't know whether I've answered your question or just rambled on. But
No, I think that's right. I mean, the sense of needing to give the artist space and time to grow, I think, is important, and it's something that we've touched on just in terms of the dynamics of the market right now, and this expectation of more and growing and constantly producing.
I mean, what I would say is that sometimes when we get paintings from artists who are painters, it's and particularly figurative, which we don't really have very many for God knows why. It's it is different. It is a bit different. It's a pretty fast-moving process, and I think that the galleries has to be able, put the brakes on so that an artist can evolve without being under constant pressure. I don't know, maybe sort of Allegra has some views about this.
Well, I would say that's very important. I mean, what you just said, the sitting in the shade part. I say that to artists all the time, that they need to have that time to stare at the wall, do nothing, destroy a painting, make work that they hate, and the sitting in the shade, the growing, the thinking, the coming up with the ideas, the discarding ideas, going down a path that turns out to be fruitless but then fruitful is making art. and it is not a production line, and they must be able to do that, and they must have that time, and it must be protected by the gallery, and that's extremely important. And I always refer to myself as the bulldog, of an artist's time, to say, you have to keep it sacred, because that time in your studio is very, very important.
Yeah, absolutely. Allan, I don't know if you have any strong feelings about artists' time. Anything to protect it? I mean, you're coming at it from a slightly different perspective.
Yeah, I have two thoughts. One is that I think it will be very difficult to, there are very few, if any, artists who get extremely early success that they work to fulfill that will build lasting visions. I just think it's an unfortunate reality of what happens when one thinks they're evolving, but they're feeding a need. There are... I saw the very beginnings of this art market in the late 1970s, and there wasn't a market for young artists at that time. The market kind of stopped with pop art and minimalism. And there were artists, as Lucy referred to, the pictures generation. David Sally did installations, he did performance, he did drawings and crude paintings that were a critique of painting within a larger network of ideas. And then at a certain point, he went down the road of painting, because that's, he may have a different way of seeing it than I see it, and this is not unique to David, but I've seen many, many artists who got naturally led in a direction where they were making work for shows rather than developing work. And so that space of freedom is really hard. There's something to be said for an artist like Paul McCarthy or Pope L, who didn't get success until their 50s or later, who built up a clarity of what they were doing and why, independently of whether or not they were financially supported. But to get back to your first question in this round about other trends or genres becoming significant, I have like two thoughts. One is that we've been seeing quite a bit of abstraction lately that I find really, really interesting. And it's mostly made by women. And it's made, at least as much of what's interesting is by artists of color, it's become like a different way of approaching abstraction. It's not coming at it through a formal language, which is a kind of line that seems to, for the most part, have played itself out decades ago, but we're kind of recognizing that more and more now. But I would also say that there are so many different kinds of approaches to what one is making and why one is making art that includes representation, that I think what's being said, what is being depicted, whose voice it is, and where that's coming from are, to me, more essential characteristics in defining what I find compelling or that speaks to me, rather than whether it's figurative or abstract.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and I have a lot of questions I would love to ask, to piggyback off that, but I believe we're going to questions from the audience now. So maybe somebody else wants to ask a follow-up to that, or any questions at all. Please raise your hands. Because otherwise I'm going to ask about NFTs or something. So, in the second row, there's a microphone.
My question is just...
Push the button up so you get the red light.
I can also repeat it. Yeah.
Yeah, I would just like your thoughts on how you guys are seeing things going at auction of contemporary artists right now.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess we kind of glossed over the nitty gritty of this, but I think the question is essentially kind of this dynamic that we've touched on of artists' work turning up at auction very shortly after it's been sold by their gallerist, or even from their studio directly. How does that tangibly sort of affect, for better and for worse, their market and their career? Don't know if anybody feels particularly strongly about laying this out.
Yeah, I think most of them are doomed. I mean, most of them are. And by the way, there's not a single artist who's emerged over the period of time in which I've been tracking contemporary art, which is longer than I care to admit I have the age to do. But there's no one who's been immune to ups and downs in taste and priority. The one artist who seemed to have been immune to it for the longest time was Cindy Sherman, and even her market has experienced dips in the last few years. So that's kind of normal. I think it's all rooted in how grounded that artist is. There are a number of quote, young artists whose works are selling for massive sums at auction who are not necessarily so young. You know, it's a little different. They have histories behind them. But I think an artist who experiences that kind of financial attention early on, and it's not about the numbers, it's about the number of people who are seeking to buy that work. I think the market really gets in the way more often than it doesn't. But I would also add that if you're so there's a collection I work on with a collector whose budget has not increased over the decades while the price of art has increased tremendously. The collection is being gifted to a major museum. Sometimes something that was a very significant acquisition early on becomes worth so much money that a collector has to face a kind of dilemma or decision of, can you afford to keep the work? If you're building a collection that's meant to go to an institution, for example, what else could you do with that money? And it's an unfortunate reality that if you're not somebody who's buying in the way that NFTs have gone to auction, sorry to borrow your fallback topic, that have been sold for ridiculous amounts of money. Clearly, in many of these instances, $100 or $10 million didn't really make a difference to the person buying the work. But most collectors do have limitations, at least those who are immersed in very contemporary art. They do have budgets. They can't go beyond it. And sometimes, someone's facing a dilemma that they didn't sign on for, but the market brought it to them. And so I think it's important to recognize that these are not always profiteers, although a vast number of them are.
We've got another question in the second row, and then come to the first row.
I'm just curious, I don't know if we can speak to it, but this initial frenzy of online buying, is there any buyer's remorse that you can talk about? Or are people happy with what they bought that they didn't see? Did they keep it? Are they selling it? What's the vibe with that?
This is, I guess, a question for Allegra and Lucy. Any buyer's remorse from those digital buyers during the early era of the pandemic?
Not in my experience, no. No.
No, I haven't had anybody express remorse. No.
Great. In the front row.
So you've talked a lot about younger artists, but I'm curious to sort of ask about the opposite, which is older artists. I feel like there's been a bit of a wave of older artists who are people of color, women who are having more recognition, more gallery shows, more museum shows. And I'm curious if the market has borne out some of that success, if the market reflects that kind of revisiting.
So this question is about kind of older artists who are discovered later in their careers, later in their lives, and are kind of, sign on with a major gallery, start turning up at auction more often, are recognized by a major museum. How that, it sounds like, plays out in the market, or is that late in career recognition, does that necessarily translate to the commercial side? I guess whoever feels strongly
I'll
on
pick
this.
this one up too. Interestingly and reassuringly, most artists who are, quote, rediscovered, at least in this phase of the art market, and American artists in particular, but it's not exclusive to American artists, their work moves through private galleries. It doesn't move through the auction houses, and it doesn't show up very often at auction with the same rapidity or the same speed as a hot younger artist. So I think there's, more often than not, it's seeing work that we either embarrassingly overlooked or work that we couldn't see for what it was at the time. And so that's interesting. I think those tend to be longer-term commitments, and perhaps in most instances a higher percentage of works being acquired by institutions than would be the case otherwise.
I think it's just important to note on that point that a lot of those artists have not been discovered so much. They've been working the whole time. I mean, Stanley Whitney has been working forever, and in 2000 and whatever, I don't know, 5 or 6, he was showing in a gallery called Esso Gallery that, nobody really knew about. And he was well known in certain circles, but not as widely appreciated. And the same for somebody like Simone Lee. I mean, she's been working forever. It's just that right now the spotlight has shone upon them, and that's great because in many ways it's so much better because they've had time to develop and do their things when nobody was putting pressure on them, nobody was asking them for shows, nobody was saying to them, you can't sit and think about something. So they haven't sort of emerged necessarily out of nowhere. They've been doing the work. Yeah.
This is fascinating, and I wish we could go further down this road, but I think we're actually out of time. So, yeah, we're out of time, but thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.